one of the funny things about this is that we make a lot of assumptions when we do things, right? Especially when it comes to management. In HR, you always have this concept of like, let's buy everybody headspace. Like that's gonna solve everything, right? But little do they realize that like, for a lot of people, that's not the right fit. Wellness and health, and especially mental health, is so subjective. And it's ingrained in almost our biology to a certain extent as far as how we recover. And it's driven from trauma and a bunch of other things. Like for example, like a 4-day work week, like we've talked about that, right? We've actually saw that a 4-day work week for a sales team sometimes actually has a negative effect.
Hi friends, welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Bryan Smith. Bryan's the co-founder and CEO of Leon Health Science. It's a service that, and I'm quoting here, helps companies figure shit out when it comes to their employees' happiness, well-being, and performance. And that's the key. Well-being is the key to performance and improving performance and enabling people to become the very best version of themselves. So we have to stop thinking that the answer to every sales performance issue is to work harder or make more calls. So in our conversation, Bryan and I talk about the science of performance improvement. And he knows what he's talking about. Bryan was a sports scientist with USA Track and Field. That's the organization that oversees the development of the top track and field athletes in the world. And we dig into the science about how and why being in sales is like being an athlete. And Bryan shares why we, meaning all of us in sales, need to adopt a more scientific approach to monitoring the things that truly do affect our performance in sales. Things like sleep and accumulated stress and recovery and nutrition. Things we should be monitoring every day. These are our personal KPIs, if you will. And these personal KPIs are much more likely to predict your ability to perform and the level of performance you can attain than your sales activity KPIs. Bryan also shares how Leon is pioneering the field of wellness intelligence and talks about how they've created a wellness performance index that will enable managers to more accurately understand and assess the readiness of their revenue teams to perform. It's good stuff. I really love this approach to things. And I think this is finally true performance management coming to sales. So all of this and much, much more. Before we get to Bryan, though, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it. You could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.
Pleasure having you. So tell us a little bit about Leon.
Yeah. I think the easiest way to put this is that, people don't quit their companies, they quit their managers, right?
Yes.
And Leon was built to ultimately give managers better data and actionable playbooks to be able to take care of their people. So ultimately, we can predict employee burnout, we can predict mental health issues, we can predict organizational resiliency and grit, and then on the back end, we actually quantify specific playbooks for managers to implement. Like for example,
Yes.
we can tell you the effect of implementing a 4-day work week with a SaaS sales team. We can tell you the effect of decreasing meetings.
How do you do that?
Yeah, so a bunch of different things. So it probably makes sense to back up a little bit. So my background is in sports science. So I worked with USA Track and Field, ultimately to predict performance or predict injury in professional athletes, right?
Right.
And we did that using data science.
Yeah, I was going to say, which is a big thing these days in sports and too slow to be uptaken by sales, I guess, I'm a huge soccer fan. So, sometimes I'm tuning on the tube to see one of my favorite players and he's sitting on the bench and it's not because he's injured. It's just because the data said, we predict there could be a higher probability of injury if he played today. So maybe we'll give him the last 20 minutes of the game as a sub.
Yeah, that's completely right. In sports, we did a bunch of things, right? So we'd look at anywhere from, on the field testing to muscle biopsies and blood testing and slow brainwave activity measuring and all sorts of different things, right? And like I said before, ultimately it was about predicting performance or predicting injury. But when you really look at it, and a salesperson or a product manager, whoever it is the same biological organism as an athlete, right? That's the way we perceive stress and deal with stress is really the same way. The only difference in an athlete is they have more like localized stress, right? Like their Achilles or their hamstrings or whatever. But like systemically and biologically, the stress response is the same, right?
Sure.
So with Leon, what we did is for the past roughly about 3.5 years, we've been collecting survey data and Salesforce data and Asana data and all these different things to ultimately develop a data model to help us understand what type of performance drop-offs you see when you compare survey data with Salesforce data and whatnot. So ultimately, it's a data science model, and then we just give it inputs, right? So we say, all right, what happens if you implement a 4-day work week? How does the data change? What happens when you eliminate meetings for a certain period of time? Or even on the opposite side, because this is where it's pretty cool, is we don't just tell you the teams that are beat up. We actually tell you the teams that are actually highly recovered as well, right? Because in sports, we're ultimately trying to drive adaptation, right? Like we're trying to cause stress and understand what happens. So with Leon, we'll actually tell you the companies that are highly recovered or highly resilient, and then provide you recommendations of how you can actually increase stress, be it KPIs or OKRs or whatever that is.
Well, increase stress without increasing well-being. Without decreasing well-being, excuse me.
Right. So ultimately, it's not about the giving of stress that is the problem. It's the timing of that stress. Sometimes giving stress is a good thing, right? Because that causes an adaptation. It causes an increase in performance. Other times it's not. So we'll tell you we call them growth windows. We'll tell you the window of opportunity that you have with your specific team right now. And you either support them or you challenge them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I understand some of the physiology behind adaptation, but I mean that works in sort of a muscular or aerobics standpoint. But if you're not sort of tracking those physiological factors, how do you tracking adaptability?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we tested is we looked at the viability of using sort of survey and questionnaires and compared that against HRV measures, right? So we were able to show, and actually sport has shown this as well, that a wellness questionnaire done at a specific cadence is just as predictable for overall systemic stress as heart rate variability is. You just got to remove some of the noise out of the data. Right. So I mean, quite honestly, if an employee tells you they're stressed out, most of the time they are actually stressed out. And from there, you just have to understand if you back off or you give more stress or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sort of the thing, right? So there's a survey that's just going to be released or has been released as part of Mental Health Awareness Month this month from uncrushed.org of sellers. And one of the notable sort of findings was that virtually 75% of the respondents said they felt extremely stressed or stressed. Is that, gets into that issue that we were sort of talking about before is sales is there's a certain element of stress that you're not going to be able to erase from it. But we seem to have gone beyond the tipping point, right? And so what's the role of the organization? What's the role of managers to be able to tamp that down and make it more productive?
Right. So if you look at it, the goals that we have as a company are the goals ultimately that we have, right? They don't necessarily change. That's sort of the object of control, right? Most of the time what happens is we have the individual and we just throw stress at the individual. And when I say stress, I mean like OKRs or upskilling or just whatever your performance goals are as a sales rep, right? What we need to understand is that stress isn't necessarily the bad thing, right? It's the timing of the stress, all right? So what I argue is that we need to be more careful about how we organize and structure a period of performance for a group of sales teams, right? So that might be introducing back off weeks, right? That might be reducing, your sales performance numbers, either if it's calls or meetings set or whatever it is, for a certain period of time. So we need to almost build in, from an athlete perspective, peak weeks and recovery weeks, right? Where you can allow this sort of high performance, but then recovery, and then high performance and recovery, right? Because ultimately what's happening is we're looking for this linear curve of performance, right? We always want to have that fit. I say fitness, but I mean that on more of a biological level, or more of not necessarily to be able to run a mile. We want that fitness curve to continuously go up. But what ends up happening with sales performers, we introduce stress, and we continually introduce stress, all right, without back off weeks, without recovery periods, with anything along those lines. And what ends up happening is that overall fitness of that individual drops, right? So over time, our employees their resiliency, or their grit or adaptability, is decreasing over time.
Sure.
Where we need to be able to have that increase over time, right? So to answer your question, we just need to be smarter about how we give stress and set goals, and understand schedules and things like that, because that's the only way that's going to change, right? Because stress is always going to be there. The goals of the company are always going to be there. You have to be smarter about how you manage it.
Right. And to your point, I mean, the way you train for a marathon, right, is to be able to take on more stress, right? Ultimately. So, and I agree that seems very useful. But it seems like the sort of barrier, if you will, really comes from the management ranks, right? Because they are the givers of the stress more often than not. And certainly in sales, we still have the sort of endemic macho attitude about suck it up, do what you got to do, so on and so on and so forth. What are you seeing in terms of your sales efforts when you're talking to companies about sort of management receptivity to this type of data, and whether they're prepared to do anything about it? Because, I can give you a chapter and verse about things that we've talked about in sales that managers need to do to help drive improved performance, and there's not much in the way of adoption of these things.
Yeah, I agree. And we're sort of going through this right now, right? Where, Leon is a product built for managers. But as soon as we start talking to managers about burnout or health or anything along those lines, the tendency is to sort of kick it up to HR, right? and that this is not a manager problem.
Yeah, don't bring your personal shit to work.
Exactly.
Even though it's work induced, but yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I think we're starting to see where managers are becoming more like coaches, right? This is that sort of future of work concept where, they're more coaching individuals rather than just prescribing stress, like you said. But yeah, definitely the barrier is there, that managers in a lot of ways don't feel like they need to manage this process, right? They say, this is my goal. My job is to push the number, and that's it. But that, and you had that same exact process in sports, right? For the 1970s and 1980s, it was my job is to win a Super Bowl or win a gold medal. So I'm just going to destroy my team while I do that. But, obviously they smartened up and realized that the athlete or the employee is ultimately the asset, right? And you need to be able to manage that asset appropriately.
Well, that seems to be the big gap, and I've talked about this on the show a lot, is the big gap between other performance-based pursuits like professional sports and sales is, we don't look at the seller as this athlete that needs to be coached and nurtured and trained a certain way. I was wondering how, I think what you're doing is a way to sort of try to close that gap, because when you look at just look at the way soccer teams staff their teams in terms of the coaches, the nutritionists, and the physios, and the sports psychologists, and we could have large sales organizations with 200 sellers and they have none of those things. No specialized knowledge that comes in. And I said, that's why I'm excited about what you're doing. It's beginning to do that, but it seems like to really make it happen, there has to be this cultural shift that says you have to look more holistically at performance as opposed to just did you make the number of calls today.
Mm-hmm. No, you're completely right. And I think a lot of that comes down to is, there's a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Have you ever read it?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's by Sapolsky out of Stanford, and it's a book about stress. And there was one study that he talked about Holocaust survivors, right? Mm-hmm. And then Holocaust survivors, what they did is they looked at I believe 2 generations later, and that they looked at the ability of their great-grandchildren to be able to adapt to stress, mm-hmm. right? And what they found was that their great-grandchildren lacked a certain hormone or an abundance of a hormone to adapt to stress, mm-hmm. right? Because ultimately their great-grandparents who survived, the Holocaust, depleted that biological ability, right? And this is this concept of epigenetics. And the reason I bring this up is it's important for managers to understand that, it's N equals 1. None of us are exactly the same. All right. The way that I adapt to stress and the way that you adapt to stress right. are 2 very, very different things. So I think it starts with a manager's understanding that there is no blanket manager style or, goal structure or anything along those lines that work. And that ultimately you do have to manage on a one-on-one basis. And then from there, then you have to you have to have a toolbox to understand the type of strategies to implement, right? To improve mm-hmm. these type of things. I don't think just managers have a good understanding of how to improve those things. And then going back to my last statement, the science behind it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I and this is not to critique sales managers, but we don't train them or enable them at all in the science of performance improvement. The answer was always work harder, or change these 3 words on the subject line of your email, or say these 3 words at this time in this call. And it's not really done on the one-on-one level the way that it should, even though, yes, coaching is future of business, but the uptake's pretty slow, right? And that's why I'm sort of excited by things you're doing is for the managers who are open-minded to this, it gives them something to say, look, this is a possibility of unlocking another aspect about actually improving performance, looking at an individual level. I mean, there's some people that we have a guy that we have an episode on our show that interviewed Brandon Fluharty that's developing this venture to talk about the physiological aspects of performance and how that relates to sales, sleep, rest, recovery, stress. Very important.
Yeah. No, and it's really not that hard, Andy, to tell you the truth. To give you like sort of in a general example, for any of the sales managers listening, like all you really need to do is develop a 3-question survey on a scale of 1 to 5, right? Asking about mm-hmm. stress, asking about sleep, and asking about recovery. Mm-hmm. And then maybe do that before and after a sales sprint, right? Right. That way you can get a sort of understanding as far as like what the cost of that sales sprint was. And then what you do is just track that out over a mm-hmm. spreadsheet over a long period of time, right? And then you can get a little bit predictive with it. Like you can understand that, all right, in December, and December's like sales goals, my team has a big drop off, or coming out of December, right. They have a big drop off. Why is that, right? And then maybe what you do is you come into the next following year into December, maybe you back off a little bit. Right? Maybe you give them a recovery week before December starts mm-hmm. or before that next sprint. So it gives you a little bit more intelligence, right? You just need to be able to zoom out a little bit and just understand exactly what's happening with your team and within your organization. From there, then you can make decisions, right? Then you can talk about reducing hours or eliminating meetings or whatever that is. Or even on the opposite side, giving your team more autonomy. Right? Mm-hmm. We talk about autonomy, but if a team is really burnt out, giving them our autonomy is not going to be a good thing, right? Because at that point, they need more support.
Right.
They don't need to just be left alone and tell them to go work on a side project.
Right. Well, yeah, I think the key is recognizing when to give autonomy, but I think that is one of the issues that really creates and leads to burnout in sales these days, is that given we've got these wonderful technologies that now exist for sales, but the way they're being utilized by most managers is to, I believe, in a way that increases stress, right? Because now we're measuring the hell out of you every second of your day. When, to your point before, is much like coaching needs to be done effectively on a one-on-one basis, is, hey, every salesperson has their own unique way of looking at the world, responding to the world, engaging with the world. And rather than use the technology to take a more blanket approach to it, is we need to use it like a tool like Leon to say, hey, here's a more individual approach, and I can help this person fine-tune what they're doing to perform at a higher level.
No, I completely agree. And, one of the funny things about this is that we make a lot of assumptions when we do things, right? Especially when it comes to management. In HR, you always have this concept of like, let's buy everybody headspace. Like, that's going to solve everything, right?
Right.
But little do they realize that, that's, for a lot of people, that's not the right fit, right? Like, wellness and health, and especially mental health, is so subjective. And it's ingrained in almost our biology to a certain extent as far as how we recover. And it's driven from trauma and a bunch of other things. And like, for example, like a 4-day work week, like we've talked about that, right? We've actually saw that a 4-day work week for a sales team sometimes actually has a negative effect, and actually causes more stress. All right. And understand that like a sales team is very different than a product team, right? Because it's not like when they implement that 4-day work week, they're reducing goals. It's not like they're, by that reduced hours, the company is now increasing salary to a certain extent to make up for potentially the missed bonuses that you might have, or the potential missed deals, right? So that's where we get into this sort of concept of like understanding the strategies that we implement. Like, you tell someone to eliminate meetings. Like, I'm a salesperson. We're like, what the hell do you mean eliminate meetings? Like, I can't do a meeting on Friday?
Well, I presume you're talking about internal meetings, the bureaucratic type that take away from selling time, but yeah.
Yeah. So like, so all those things matter, right? And you have to be able to, if not quantify, at least understand the effect that you're trying to get with the strategy that you implement.
Well, I think your point is really the one that a lot of us are sort of driving at when we talk about performance improvement, is that every little thing matters. Just as oftentimes, and I'm not the only one, cite this example of Dave Brailsford, who ran the Sky bike racing team for Tour de France, who was famous for coining this phrase, the aggregation of marginal gains. There was nothing too insignificant for him to turn his attention to try to get that one, not even 1%, that fraction of a percent improvement, because over a 2,300 mile race over 21 days, the margin of victory could be a couple of minutes, which means less than a second a day, right? I mean, it's like razor thin. And I think the same thing works in sales, right? We have to sort of assume that increasingly, as products become more commoditized and barriers to entry drop, that our margin of victory is going to be razor thin. So what are the things that we can look at, and there's nothing too small, but what are the things we can look at to try to improve overall performance? And that's why I love this idea of looking at wellness and mental health and some of the physiological things that we just don't consider, even though we are in nominally this very sort of competitive athletic field.
No, I agree. And to your point before, we all love ringDNA, we're giving great insight and great data, into managers. But like you said, that does increase stress to a certain extent. To now know that every call that's listened to or monitored or whatnot is going to be assessed. It's tough. And there's obviously value in it from a company standpoint, and that it's a needed thing. But you also have to back that up. That if you're going to introduce more stress to your people and you're going to introduce more monitoring, that you have to have it on the opposite side, right? That you have to be able to understand that you are increased total, stress load on the individual. Then how are you going to counteract that on the back end?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to think about, right? Because hopefully we are moving beyond, like I said, sort of the Stone Age in sales, where we fundamentally manage it the same way we did 100 years ago. Is we have all these the thing I've been advocating on the show is we have all these tools and technologies, things like Leon coming out. We need to start taking advantage of them to help people become the best version of themselves. And so, it seems like the barrier really starts with management. And so that's sort of interesting as I was going through all your materials is like, okay, so when you're doing these assessments and you're doing these wellness indexes and so on, are you including management in there? Because surely they feel stressed just as much as the sellers do.
Totally. Yeah, totally. They're part of the teams that when we do assess these type of things. And we're getting to the point right now where we can provide some sort of manager playbooks for them to be able to sort of mitigate some of the issues that they're going through. But majority of it's built on the employee right now, but we are collecting their data and giving them recommendations for sure.
So sort of in the face of what's happened over the last year, what are you seeing through your customers? Like the primary causes of burnout? I mean, we sort of speculate, and we do because of sort of the abnormal situation we've all lived in. But what are you seeing in your data? What's driving burnout these days?
Yeah. I think it makes sense to sort of back up and maybe define what burnout is, right? And then we can go from there. Burnout, most of the time when we talk about burnout on LinkedIn or Harvard Business Review or whatever it is, it's most of the time at the end result, right? Like we talk about burnout as most of the time a mental health problem, right? Because that's the end result. It ends up in depression. But in the beginning, burnout is really an allostatic load process, right? Where your autonomic nervous system is getting taxed on a very, very high rate consistently, which is causing a fight or flight response over a long period of time, which at that point you get stuck in that fight or flight response, right? And your body starts making these hormonal changes, which then cause changes on a brain level, right? Which then lead to depression and anxiety and all these other things. So the problem is when you talk about what type of things are defining burnout, there is no one type of thing that defines burnout, right? Because burnout is ultimately about systemic stress on an individual, either coming from personal or pandemics or work or anything along these lines, on those lines. The problem with burnout right now is we've leaned too far into the organizational psychologist world of understanding burnout, but it needs to be there needs to be a better discussion about understanding it from a physiology standpoint, a biology standpoint, as well as a psychology standpoint, right? Because that's the only time we're going to make sort of big changes. So much like the uncrushed thing that you mentioned, the survey that you mentioned, over 82% of the employees that we're tracking right now are trending towards burnout or in currently burnout within the companies that we work with.
And so how's that being indicated in the data?
How's that being indicated? Meaning, what is causing that information?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a manager looking at a report, or one of your indexes, what are they seeing? What's the indication? Is it I don't know, absenteeism? Is it workload? What are you seeing that says, hey, this is a red flag?
We don't really assess it that way, to tell you the truth. Okay. We're looking at total stress load of an individual, all right, to understand what is affecting that. Now, and we did that purposely. And the reason that we do that is because we don't want it to take into account that either company culture is affecting burnout, because that removes the concept of that the person's personal life can't be affected. All right. And that doesn't add to that. Right. So when we only look at burnout on an organizational structure, all right, then you're removing probably 85% of the other person's life that is adding to that, right?
Right.
So to answer your question, we don't know, right? We just know that people are highly stressed out, and that the way that we go about trying to fix that is by implementing some sort of strategy to help them recover.
Well, it's just interesting what data you're gathering to indicate that the burnout is trending in a certain direction. Is this survey data that people do as part of your app?
Yeah, so it's a combination of things. So we have Apple Health Kit data. All right, so that could be either measuring HRV or heart rate or sleep. We have survey data, as well as some beta testing we're going through with Salesforce data coming in. So all that combined with survey, Salesforce, and Apple Health Kit data gives us a composite picture as far as what's going on individually.
Okay, so you do integrate data from like wearables and so on if somebody has a Whoop or an Aura or what have you.
Correct, yeah.
Oh, okay, well that's cool. I've got my new 8 sleep pod cover, which is trying to help me sleep better. But yeah, I mean, every morning I wake up, look at my sleep dashboard, my sleep debt, and my HRV, and so on.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too. It's like when you start taking in the physiological stuff. There's a lot of variables there, right? Like, 'cause some people have higher HRV, some people have lower HRV, and some of the times the problem with Whoop and whatnot is.
Why don't you explain the HRV for people real quickly, just so they understand the heart rate variability?
Yeah, so heart rate variability is a measure of the time in between each heartbeat, right? The more variable, the more negative, the less variable, the more positive, right? Ultimately, what that's doing, it's giving us a snapshot of your parasympathetic or sympathetic branches of your autonomic nervous system. All right, so ultimately, we're looking for a balance between the two, right? We want to be slightly sympathetic, slightly parasympathetic. When you stress yourself out or burn out, you have a tendency to go highly sympathetic, right? You go into a fight or flight response.
So less variability in the heart rate between heartbeats.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Sort of intuitively opposite of what you would think, but yeah.
Yeah. So, and then on the opposite end, what ends up happening long term is with the sympathetic branch. What ends up happening is you get so stuck in a sympathetic branch that the sympathetic actually shuts down, and you go into a very, very deep parasympathetic response, where your body can't invigorate itself anymore. Right? And it can't actually get excited for work or anything along those lines. What ends up happening longer term is that's when you see that parasympathetic, that depression and anxiety kick in, because the sympathetic response has been so fatigued that the body can't recover anymore.
So it's like the equivalent of a distance runner overtraining.
100%. It's exactly the same thing. There's actually no difference in it with on a physiological level between burnout and overtraining. We just only look at it from an organizational standpoint.
Right. Well, again, this is why it's so interesting, is that, the human body affects your ability to sell at as many levels. And as much as you want to say, look, whatever happens outside the office just doesn't matter, don't bring your baggage with us. To your point earlier is, 80, maybe 85% of it is dictated by things that happen outside work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Rest, recovery. Yeah. I mean, it's my hope, and especially managers listening to this, that you look at things like this, because quite honestly, you look at sales performance, at least there's not much data that sort of compares growth and sales productivity and sales performance. But in general, the data, as far as we can tell, says that, look, we haven't gotten any better at this over the last 30, 40 years, technology notwithstanding. And part of that is because we're trying to pull the same levers that we've always pulled. And there's only a limited amount you're going to get out of pulling those levers. And so if we're really serious about performance, we have to look at these other aspects. And if I understand from what you're saying, which certainly would make sense, is to the degree we start looking some of this more holistically at performance as individuals, is that we then begin to address at least some of the work-related mental health issues, perhaps, or have the potential to, that we're not addressing today.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to, Andy, is that we're moving to an area where the conversation is being had, right? Where mental health and burnout and all these things are actually there. But what we need to move towards is understanding how to mitigate these things, right? And because everything we do right now is it's reactionary, right? It's oh shit, my employees are burned out. What do I do? Where we need to zoom out a little bit and look at everything, like you said, on a holistic level to understand how we can mitigate that to begin with. And that's the problem, right? And I think we're moving towards there, but that's what we don't have yet is, understanding the correct actionable strategies to implement to mitigate these things before they ever happen.
Well, and I think that, at least for me, the encouraging thing about this, at least if it's implemented the right way by managers, is that you really can start looking at things on an individual level that you were overlooking before. So, one thing that happens in sales, as is managers put people into strata, right? You're A player, B player, C player, unmindful of most of what's behind that ranking, right? Whether the person's burned out, whether the person has certain things going on that could be addressed, that from a mental health perspective or whatever. And it's my great hope that, and I have always rebelled against that, right? Because I think we sort of come in this current age, we're sort of obsessed with this idea of top performers. And the goal should be is we want everybody to be good at what they do. And if we have more data, not just about the calls they make and not just about the calls, within the calls, what's happening within their calls, but what's happening with the person, that it gives us a better chance of helping more people build a career that's sustainable in sales.
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. Not everybody's going to be a top performer, right? And we tend to build our sales, I guess, program, for lack of a better word, to build top performers. But it's not like sports in that sense, right? It's not like people are going through, T-ball to Little League to Babe Ruth to, high school to college to pros, right? Like there's no graduate, there's no period there where, they're not getting weeded out, right? When they come to
there's no minor league.
Exactly, right? So we do have to understand that the goals that we set for our people and the environments we create need to be built for everybody to a certain extent, and not just top performers or high performers or whatever that is. And I think that's where that sports analogies probably become a little bit of an issue.
Sure.
Because, and a lot of times they're not a professional athlete, and a lot of times you do have to treat them like they're a high schooler, from a stress level standpoint,
Well, this is one of the areas that's of concern to me too, is that actually some organized sports at the professional level, again, soccer being an example, oftentimes do quite well, is as part of their onboarding of people into an organization is, as one manager said, we train the person before we train the player. And we sort of have this assumption in business and sales in particular that the people we hire have these sort of fundamental human skills, resilience and ability to adapt and so on, that maybe they don't have. Maybe they haven't been exposed to environments where they had to develop that. Maybe they've never been, socialized that way. And we should be paying attention to that. And we should say, hey, this is part of what we're doing is we're going to add some time into our onboarding. We're going to add some learning, some education or curriculum into our onboarding process to help people with this, because this was so important.
Yeah. I agree. It's funny, like that word resilience, right? Cause it gets thrown around a lot, and it's a great word. And ultimately that's what we're trying to do with our employees, is that we're trying to make them more adaptable, right? Like we want to know that if we give them stress, all right, that they're going to be able to adapt to it positively. Right. But to your point, like resilience on an individual level is dictated by so much that we have no control over. Your mother or father probably has more of an impact of your individual resiliency than your manager, your company ever will. You
Yeah.
know?
Well, someone once asked me, what's the cause of poor salespeople? And I said, bad parenting.
Yeah. But that's honestly true, and it begs to mention is that the way that we manage people it needs to live and breathe, right?
Right.
Like nothing we do in sales should ever be stoic, right? It should never be something that is not malleable or
Mm-hmm.
adaptable,
Mm-hmm.
because there's too many inputs, like there's too many things that come along. So, again, going back to that N=1 approach, it's we need to be able to look at everything we do on a leadership standpoint. If it's schedules, if it's our KPIs or whatever goal structure we implement, to upskilling or whatever, and then it all needs to be adaptable to the individual and the team at where they're at right now within their current life.
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. I one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard. It was early in my career as from a business school professor, and was lecturing at our sales kickoff meeting at this startup I was with at that time. And he said that in his mind, the number one skill you need to develop for success was a tolerance of ambiguity. And it speaks to this whole idea of adaptability, right? It's because we live in a world that's full of ambiguity. Just look at the rapid pace of change we've seen over the last 20, 30, 40 years with technology that's changed so much of the way we conduct our lives. You have to be prepared for things changing. You have to be prepared for things being uncertain, for the rules not being clearly laid out, and be able to adapt, to operate within those environments. And that fundamentally is what, in my mind, is what sales is about. Right? Every time you go talk to a buyer, they may fit an ideal client profile, but you're talking to an individual who has his own unique or her own unique ways of looking at the world and way of gathering data and processing data and linking and connecting with another person. Every time it's going to be different, and you have to be adaptable to that. If you think that it's all going to fit a cookie cutter process, then you're setting yourself up for ultimately burnout.
Yeah. No, I agree. Especially when we look at timelines. Especially with salespeople, we love timelines, right? Like we love this idea that within 90 days you should be here, within 6 months you should be here, within a year you should be there, right? And that just doesn't work, because there's too many inputs that are influencing that timeline, right? But everybody is on their own performance plan, right? It's like when we first start a new an intern or a new employee. We've gotten better at this, but most of the time what happens is we just throw as much stress at that person as we possibly can within the first year, right? It's like a sink or swim mentality.
Right.
But if you think about it, if it's a new employee, either he or she just moved out of their parents' house for the first time, is in a new city, potentially with a new job and a new social structure, and is probably feeling the most amount of stress they've ever felt in their whole entire life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at the way we set up our sales development reps and sales organizations. They're the newest, least experienced. I was going to say the most inexperienced, but least experienced. They fit the profile you start talking to. First, for many, probably the first job out of college. And yeah, the stress we level on them with the expectations of what they're going to do, with so little training and certainly so little training from an emotional intelligence standpoint, that's almost criminal, because the most you get from a manager is, rejection. Don't take it personal. It's like, that's it. I guarantee they're taking it personally. I've been I started in sales making cold calls. Yeah, it felt very personal. And Mayha is one of the ones that maybe got through it okay, but lots of them don't. The reason a lot of people don't work out, I suspect, is not because they're not capable of doing the job, but the circumstances we put them into, we don't prepare them for at all.
No, I agree. It's sending a cold email or listen, I'm a founder, right? And I still have a lot of issues making cold calls, right? It stresses me the hell out. And you would think, I don't have anybody over top of me who's telling me that I need to make a cold call, right? I don't have I'm not on some performance plan that's telling me that I'm about to lose my job in 6 months.
Right.
So those things are impactful to people. And going back to our resiliency discussion, some people don't have the resiliency to do that within the time frame that you want them to do it.
Exactly.
And that's the most important thing. And that's why, going back to, it's not the thing that you do, it's the timing of the thing that you do. All right. And that's what we need to understand, is that if we want to build resilient organizations full of culturally diverse people, then we have to zoom out a little bit and manage on a more real-time basis.
Yeah. I mean, I harken back to when I got hired my first job out of college, working for a huge computer corporation and like the big tech companies of the day. This was sort of pre-Silicon Valley in some respects. They needed 1,000 sellers. They hired 3,000, right? Every year. And with the express goal that some number of people are going to be sort of weeded out. But there weren't these like, you had to do X by X time frame. It tended to be fairly organic. People sort of came to that realization themselves to a large extent that over the course of a year that, hey, this just wasn't for them. But we do nothing similar today, even though we're technically doing the same thing. We're weeding people out, but we're not hiring extras. We're just hiring the number we need, and the pressure's intense.
No, I agree, and that's where data comes in, man. It's like, we can know how stressed out these people are, right? But the problem is we do 6-month engagement surveys, and that makes some big organizational pivot.
Right.
By that time, you've already lost 50% of your sales team,
or you've lost them in place. I mean, I think that's the thing that happens more frequently. To the point we talked about earlier is, people just get sort of burnt out and the productivity slows down, and they become increasingly frustrated because they're wondering why they're not developing the way they thought, or things aren't happening for them as well as they did before, and they're sort of there.
But that goes back to that people management aspect, right? Is that listen, we all love HR, right? I mean, HR is fantastic, but there's also a case where like we need to save HR to a certain extent, right? Is that as managers, we're the first line of defense, man. Like we're that coach that needs to understand that if mental health or burnout or alignment issues or diversity and inclusion issues, if that's happening, like we're the ones who find out about it first, and we're the ones that can address it. But we wait and kick it up to HR because we just wash our hands of it and say, I have a goal to manage, right?
Right.
And that's not leadership. That's not performance management.
No, I agree. I think, I divide the world now into sales managers, at whatever level they're at, into two camps. So they're sales bosses or they're sales leaders. The bosses are sort of the command and control, old school, which is not old these days because it's still the vast majority of sales managers, is directive, as opposed to coaching, development, and development oriented, and a little more empathetic, and a lot of it comes from the pressures the managers feel are as intense as the ones the sellers feel these days, and so we're not equipping them with the tools they need and to understand and deal with stress and become more resilient and adaptable. Again, we promote them. We assume just because we promoted them, they have these tools, and they don't either. And I think that in general in sales is we're only going to go as far as we take the frontline managers. And right now we're not doing well by frontline managers and not equipping them to operate in this environment.
Yeah. And again, like I agree. And we're in a situation where even with your top tier salespeople, your high performers, we expect every manager to be a high performer, right? Or like this super extroverted, ABC sort of like, build high performing teams all over the place, right? Like they're like the Bill Belichick of like sales managers. Like that's what we expect everybody to be. But a lot of times you can be a great leader and not be a great leader. Does that make sense? And I mean from a stereotypical level, right? And that's okay. But we expect everybody, all our managers, to excel on one-on-ones, right? And to like rah and be this great motivator. But most of the time, our managers don't have the toolbox. Like if you're an introverted manager, you need to be able to understand what you can do without, getting up and, giving your best like Glengarry Glen Ross impersonation, in front of your sales team, and that's what we rely on, where, and a lot of it is, we handcuff our managers in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like we can't, like I should be able, or you should be able to tell your sales team, take 2 days off, or reduce your hours this week, or let me bring in an expert to talk about mental health,
right?
Without it being an inclusivity issue to a certain extent. Like if you gave this person a day off, you need to give it to the rest of the people. Because that's not fair either, because that impacts everybody.
Right. Very interesting. All right, Bryan, we could go on and on. This is great. Well, I'm excited to see what will come about with Leon, and we'll definitely have you back on, talk about it in the future again. So if people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so you can just find me on LinkedIn, or go to myleon.co and you can check us out. But we have some really good, really interesting data coming out over the next 3 to 4 months now. So I'm excited to show you guys.
Oh, good. Yeah, I look forward to seeing it. So, all right, Bryan, thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, we're so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank my guest, Bryan Smith, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you could also leave us a rating or a review and let us know how we're doing, we'd appreciate it. You can do all this on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help, and thank you so much, as always, for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.